Welcome back to Grammar Grannies, my dears. Today we're going to talk about a few more simple sentence structures. We've already looked at the SVO structure with a subject-verb-object form that expresses the agent-action-object semantic relations. We also looked at the predicate-nominative form that expresses a link between the subject and the predicate. Take a moment to see if you can think of one of each of these kinds of simple sentence structures. If you came up with an SVO sentence like, I hate grammar, and a PN sentence like, grammar is so boring, don't worry about hurting Grammar Granny's feelings. Instead, have a cookie. You're catching on to this stuff. Now, let's talk about a few other simple sentence structures that kiddos usually acquire during the preschool years. We went through a long rigmarole about negative sentences and questions and how they're formed when we talked about auxiliary verbs. Remember? Something about finding the first auxiliary verb, moving it to the front of the subject in questions, or putting not after it in negatives. And remember what happens when there's no auxiliary verb? That's when our dummy do comes in, putting in a form of the dummy do that agrees with the subject in person and number and with the main verb in tense. You might want to review Module 4B on auxiliary verbs if you've forgotten. Our discussion there was about yes-no questions specifically. Those you can answer with a yes or a no, but not the WH questions that use question words like who, what, where, when, and why. The grammar of WH questions is a little different, but follows the same basic rules about verb movement. We won't worry about the details right now, my dears. Both questions and negative sentences are important elements in children's language development, and each goes through a series of stages in children's production as they're acquired. You'll learn about these stages when you take a course in child language development. And the reason it's important to understand these kinds of sentences is that when kiddies have trouble with language development and make mistakes, we need to figure out where in that sequence of stages they are so we can know how to provide models and practice to move on to the next step in the process. Many of the language sampling systems you'll learn about for assessing free speech use the level of development in negatives and questions as part of the analysis. So you'll need to be able to examine how a child forms these kinds of sentences in order to get a full picture of where they are in the sequence of language development. Just to give one really quick example, lots of kiddies who are first starting to use these sentences or who have language disorders may say something like, what my mommy doing? Or, what my mommy is doing? When they mean, what is my mommy doing? Can you tell what the grammatical mistakes in these questions are? What my mommy doing leaves out the auxiliary verb completely. It's a common error in the early stages of language development. Kiddies don't include any auxiliary verbs. But what my mommy is doing is different and actually shows more advanced development. It does have an auxiliary, is, but the auxiliary wasn't moved toward the beginning of the sentence as the rule for negatives requires. These kinds of mistakes are seen in children at a somewhat higher level of language around Brown Stage 3, which you'll learn about in your child language course. The point is, though, that the difference between these two mistakes tells us something important about where a speaker is in the sequence of stages of language development. And it's important for us to notice what level of development each clues us into, if we're going to correctly evaluate current language level and correctly decide what kinds of sentences to model and practice in therapy. Here's a couple of other simple sentence types we should be attuned to: imperatives and passives. Imperatives are just what they sound like. They're commands. In imperatives, the speaker tells the listener more or less politely to do something. You might remember we talked about these earlier when we talked about the parts of speech and how verbs can act as a whole sentence by themselves. But here's some more examples. Listen to Grammar Granny. Practice your sentence structure analysis. Write the rule for forming negative sentences. Now, what if we were to look for the subject and predicate in each of these sentences? Grammar Granny is sure you can find the verbs. What are they? Yes, listen, practice, and write. Listen to Grammar Granny has a verb and a prepositional phrase. Practice your sentence structure analysis has a verb and a noun phrase. Write the rule for forming negative sentences has a verb and a noun phrase and a prepositional phrase. But what's the subject? Maybe this question stirs some vague memories of learning the understood subject you. That's right, the subject of all these imperative sentences is you. It's not stated, but it's understood. The speaker's talking directly to the listener. The listener is you, whoever the speaker is speaking to, because that's who you always is. Remember we talked about how I and you are deictic terms, whose meaning depends on the point of view of the speaker or who's doing the talking? If you've forgotten, you might want to review the module on determiners, where we talked about deixis. Anyway, my dears, imperative sentences are some of kiddos' earliest forms. They start with one-word utterances meant as imperatives. So even 1-year-olds might say lollipop, maybe not pronouncing it exactly right, when they want to ask for one. Before long, they say, give me lollipop, or give me truck, or whatever they want. And one of the first things adults answer to these imperatives is, say please. That's because politeness is so important to us in social communication, and adults want their kiddies to at least seem polite. So before long, the child is saying, please give me juice, maybe after a reminder. Imperatives aren't usually forms we need to help kids learn. They usually get them pretty quick as soon as they start to talk because they fill one of the first pragmatic functions kiddos want to express with their words, requests. We may need to help them acquire more polite forms, though, so people feel more inclined to give them what they want. Still, it's important to be able to recognize imperatives as one of the sentence types beginning speakers use and to understand its important pragmatic function. Passive sentences are another important simple sentence type. Some language analysis procedures, like the developmental sentence score, which you'll learn about in graduate school, require us to recognize passives as one of the indicators of level of language development. Passives are acquired relatively late in development, at the end of the preschool period or beginning of school age. The main reason they're difficult for kiddies to learn is that they're an exception to the basic SVO rule for active sentences. Actives are the opposite of passives, my dears. Remember we said that in English, we use word order to tell who is the agent and who is the object in sentences. Agents typically come at the beginning of the sentence, objects at the end. That's why these two sentences mean different things. The bank robbed the widow robbed the bank. In the first one, the bank is the doer of the action robbing. The widow is the direct object or receiver of the action. We know this because the bank is in the first position where we usually find the agent of the verb's action, and the widow is at the end where we usually find the object. In the second sentence, though, the word order is different. The widow is in that first agent position. So she's doing the action of the verb, and the bank is the object, so the bank's receiving the action of robbing. That's how English grammar works in SVO sentences. Word order tells us who's doing and who's receiving action. Now, once in a while, usually for pragmatic reasons, we may want to put the receiver of action first and the doer last. When we do, English grammar gives us a little workaround in the passive sentence. We can say, the widow was robbed by the bank. The passive sentence uses some markers, the auxiliary be plus the past participle form of the verb, and the by phrase to signal that this particular sentence doesn't follow the SVO rule. The by prepositional phrase identifies its noun phrase object as the agent of the verb's action. The be auxiliary plus the past participle form of the verb signals that this is not an SVO sentence, and the listener needs to treat the first noun as the receiver of the action rather than the doer. Then find the agent of the action in the by prepositional phrase. Pause the video for a bit and change these sentences into passives. I wrote this passive sentence. A late bus detained my arrival. Why did the chicken cross the road? And rewrite these passive sentences as active SVOs. My homework was eaten by a zombie. A bar was walked into by the passive voice. When my supervisor told me not to use I in my clinical reports, an annoying number of passive sentences was used by me. If you got, the passive sentence was written by me, my arrival was detained by a late bus, why was the road crossed by the chicken, and a zombie ate my homework, the passive voice walked into a bar, and when my supervisor told me not to use I in my clinical reports, I used an annoying number of passive sentences. Have a cookie! You're an aggressive passive learner. Now, because passives are an exception to the usual rules, it takes a while for kiddies to learn to interpret these sentences correctly. Often into the primary school years, they may use some of what are called truncated or shortened passives, often with the verb get instead of a form of be. So they might say, I got hurt, where I is the receiver of the action hurt, but no agent is stated. Or she got pulled in the wagon, where she is the receiver of the action pulled, and again, no agent is given. But they may still have difficulty understanding who's the agent and who is the object in complete passive sentences. Because passives are often used in academic language, it's important for school-age children to understand them, even if they don't use them much. So being able to identify truncated and full passives in the speech of young school-age children with language disorders will help us evaluate how far along they are in learning the exceptions to the basic rules of English that make up a lot of the language learning that happens during the school years. And understanding what passives are and why they are often hard for kids with language disorders to understand in either reading or speech will help us to improve both spoken and written comprehension of academic language. Well, that's all we're going to say about simple sentences for now, my dears. Next time we move on to complex sentences. Grammar Granny's